This talk is on the banking crisis and terrorism, and also whether there is any link between previous banking crisis and terrorism. And I'll be using the example of Jordan in this and their banking system, which was untouched by the previous crisis. Uh, Now, we are perhaps a bit hard on the banks, I think, and you might be surprised me saying this as a social democrat, because the people in the banking system, most of them are just normal people working to try and earn a living, protect their families. But then again, there are people who are like Bernard Madoff, for instance, who stole like 65 billion pounds, you know, and if you'd like to find out more about Bernard Madoff or the cost of the Iraq War, for instance, you can read these books. There's Bernard Madoff, The Man Who Stole 65 Billion, and that is by Erwin Otherland. Very good book. Also by a favourite author of mine. It's the $3 trillion war. Sorry. And the cost of the Iraq conflict, and that's by Joe Stiglitz, who's a top author in economics. He also wrote Globalization and Its Discontents. Now, the whole banking crisis started with some well-known banks, and I'm not going to say their names because it's everybody knows. For also liable reasons. But how do we know what caused that? There are things in economics called economic shocks, and those are things like wars, like El Nino, which causes disasters and things in the parts of the world. And there's also terrorism. Now, to use the example of Jordan has had a big, and also Lebanon has had a big problem with terrorism and wars and being invaded because they're between Syria and Israel, and that conflict was spilled over between Israel and Syria into their borders. Now, the banking system now has developed a way to put money aside and to continually do that and be very cautious and very prudent, to prevent them being shocked and people losing their savings accounts because of the wars and terrorist attacks. Also, in the case of Lebanese people who worked in the banking system and their families were threatened themselves. Now, this is a major problem because terrorism, if it attacks that, is a weak point in the whole system, because the banking system manages the medium of exchange, and that is the currency. Now, recently, Gordon Brown put forward the idea of a tax on all transactions. Now, this to me is also pointing more and more towards us joining the euro as a currency, because Britain is the biggest financial centre in Europe, and it's those transactions are done in pounds. Now, a tax on those will mean that not only will there be the hit from a weak pound being converted into the euro, but also the hit from a taxation which is being put aside because of the banking crisis. Now, we don't know really what caused the banking crisis. A lot of people have said it's about ninja loans, which is like no income, no job, no abode, like ninja. Okay, I don't know who makes up these silly ideas, but they're out there. Or bad mortgages, bad risk taking, and the governments want the people to be more and more prudent in their, more cautious in making these deals, which are, and the deals that are profitable are only on the margins of any deal. That is where risk exists, on the margins. And I apologise for the terrible lighting in here. I'll try and get that fixed before my other talks. Now, what will this tax do? Well, a tax also will affect the supply of deals, basically. Any tax reduces the amount of deals made. Now, maybe that's a good thing, or maybe it's a bad thing. But I certainly think taxation in itself is not always a good idea. But in this instance, I think it is a good idea. And what is more is that the EU has more teeth than, financially speaking, than the British government. If the governments are working together, it makes it much more difficult for banks, because they've got assets entrenched or invested in that economy, a good functioning economy. We also taxes being taken and then reused by the government and then reinvested, for instance, to get back the money, and there's more faith in that banking system. It makes it more difficult for banks to relocate. The banks, for instance, that people don't have faith in, will often move around, and this happens a lot on the African continent. For instance, there's been a big scandal in Nigeria about fraud between banks, because the temptation of banks to commit what in other circumstances would be called fraud is very great. For instance, the reason why we have paper money is in a sense derived from a fraud, because bank used to mean bench, where it means bench in Italian, and they would set aside the gold on one side, and and then give out paper receipts for that gold. You would store your gold in the bank, and were able to give out more paper receipts than the gold itself, and that became what's called fiat money. Now, that's not an argument for gold, although gold has really risen in value recently because of the recent crisis. Rather, I would say that it's more for something of a partial backing of our currency in some gold reserves and some paper money. Because, of course, in the 19th century, if you was to read, say, this book, which is based on a true story, that's Robert Tressel's The Irregular Trials of Philanthropists. There are some people who, of course, were paid always in real money, that is real gold, real silver, but the actual people who were doing most of the work in the economy never actually saw a gold sovereign unless it was a present, and then of course they couldn't spend it because it was too precious. What we need in this circumstance is for people to actually be taking in more credit, to get what's called a multiplier effect in economics. That is, that if I go out and buy a carpet, that's employing somebody in the carpet industry to go or I buy a TV, that's employing people in the TV industry, manufacturing industry, and then they can go out and buy holidays or beer or whatever it is, or economic books if they're interested in that. I would say to be clued up on economics, right, is to get, and you should incorporate it as part of your logic and your part of your common sense. It's a defensive mechanism, if you like, and it makes you understand what's going on in the world a bit better. So I wouldn't go on courses. I would go on and read books that are available in the public sphere, or a textbook. That's much more cheaper, and it's also doesn't necessarily mean that you need to take a course to get a good job in the banking sector. Now, as I said with the Lebanese, the Lebanese made their system shock-proof, and it only happened through a gradual system which evolved, and through legislation. So there's those two things going together. I'd like to talk further about this. I'm going to might make